In the sub $200 GPU range, price to performance is everything. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we'll be taking a look at two of those GPUs and comparing their price to performance, AMD's RX 560 and NVIDIA's GTX 1050. Released in October of 2016, the GTX 1050 started at a launch price of $109 US. Its core frequency is 1354 MHz with 640 shaders. It has 2 GB of GDDR5 memory running at 1752 MHz and is rated for 1862 gigaflops of floating point performance. With a TDP of 75 watts, it doesn't require an extra PCIe power connector. The specific model we're looking at here is the MSI GTX 1050 2GT OC. From Team Red, we have the RX 560. Released about 6 months later in April of 2017, the 560 launched at a price of only $99 US. Its core runs at 1175 MHz with 1024 shaders, has 4 GB of GDDR5 memory running at 1750 MHz, and is rated for 2611 gigaflops of floating point performance. Like the GTX 1050, it has a TDP of 75 watts, which means it doesn't require an extra PCIe power connector. This model here is the RX 560 Aero ITX from MSI. Both cards have dual slot coolers, and both cards are equipped with HDMI, DVI, and DisplayPort connectors. The test setup today is my i5 7500 build with 8 GB of DDR4 2400 memory. First up is Battlefield 1. On low settings, the GTX 1050 pretty effectively crushed the 560, almost 25% faster on average, and lows were 40 to 60% higher. On medium, the gap closes, with the 560 only trailing by about 14%, and on ultra settings, the gap between them was only about 10%. This was most likely due to the 560 having twice as much VRAM, which comes in handy once the texture and anti-aliasing settings start to get bumped up. Next, we'll look at CSGO. On low and medium settings, the 1050 led an average FPS by about 12%. The lows weren't so close. On low settings, the GTX 1050 led in 1% and 0.1% lows by close to 60%, and on medium settings, that lead increased. 1% lows on medium were 75% higher with the 1050, and 0.1% lows were more than double those of the RX 560. On high settings, the 560 trailed an average FPS by a whopping 40%, while its lows were again close to 50% lower than the GTX 1050s. Unlike in Battlefield 1, turning up the graphics settings here actually increased the performance gap. Third in line is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Performance is very similar across the board. No more than 3 FPS separate the RX 560 from the GTX 1050 all the way from low settings up to ultra. I would have thought the RX 560's extra 2 GB of VRAM, twice that of the 1050s, would make a bigger difference in a game like this with all its high-resolution textures and hefty anti-aliasing on higher settings, but it appears both cards run almost identically. Next up, GTA 5. For the first time, the RX 560 gets a win, at least on low settings. Because of the stuttering glitch that the 1050 suffers from on low settings, the RX 560 comes out well ahead. Average FPS hits 129 frames per second, while lows barely dip below 80. On medium, the 560's lead vanishes. The 1050 was 27% faster on average with about a 20% lead in 1% lows. On high settings, the 1050 ran about 20% faster average FPS, but lows were closer to the 560's. 12% faster 1% lows, but 18% slower 0.1% lows. Just Cause 3 is up next. Oddly enough, despite its usual preference for NVIDIA GPUs, results from Just Cause 3 were very similar. On low and medium settings, the 1050 only led average FPS by about 10%, while in high settings the averages were nearly identical. Lows were likewise similar across the board. No more than 7 FPS difference, but in most cases only 3 frames per second difference or less. Overwatch comes next. On low settings, the 1050 absolutely smears the RX 560. 41% faster average, 72% faster 1% lows, and a 245% lead in 0.1% lows. On high settings, the two cards come much closer together, only a 6% difference in average FPS, identical 1% lows, and the 560 about 20% faster in 0.1% lows. On epic settings, the 1050's lead comes back, 28% faster average, 24% faster 1% lows, and 8% faster 0.1% lows. In Overwatch, the GTX 1050 is the clear winner. Seventh on the list is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds or PUBG. Some of these results were a bit wonky. On low settings, the 1050 comes out well ahead with a 60% lead in average FPS while maintaining similar lows. On medium settings, the 1050 again leads with 60% higher average FPS and again similar lows. On ultra, however, things go south. Though the 1050 does come out ahead in average FPS, it falls far below the 560 in lows, dipping as far down as 8 FPS, while the 560 never dropped below 15. My guess is, like in Battlefield 1, the 560's extra 2 GB of memory come into play here as the 1050 hit its limit. Finally, we'll look at Rocket League. From the minimum settings to maxed out, the GTX 1050 led by around 22% in average FPS. The difference in lows varied as high as 245%, with the 1050 no less than 30% faster than the RX 560 in all cases. That extra VRAM didn't seem to help much here, and the 1050 comes out ahead. Now we'll look at a combined average of esports and non-esports titles for the two cards. First up, the esports average. These numbers are from the combined results of CSGO, Overwatch, and Rocket League. On low settings between the average 1% and 0.1% frame rates, the 1050 led by 20%, 57%, and 210% respectively. On medium settings, that lead continues with a 15% lead in average FPS, 32% lead in 1% lows, and 37% lead in 0.1% lows. Similarly, on high settings, the 1050 led the RX 560 in average FPS by 33%, 1% lows by 47%, and 0.1% lows by 50%. There's really not much of a competition here. Next, we'll look at the combined average for non-esports titles. These numbers come from Battlefield 1, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, GTA 5, Just Cause 3, and PUBG. Unlike with the esports titles, here the 560 isn't completely blown out of the water by the 1050. On low settings, the 1050 only leads by 13% on average. On medium settings, the 1050 leads by 22% in the average, and on high, the difference between them is only 10%. The 1050 still comes out ahead, but it's not such a beatdown as in the esports titles, likely due to the 1050's 2GB of memory versus the RX 560's 4GB. Next, we'll look at power consumption and temperatures. As always, I need to mention that basically every graphics card comes with a different cooler, so looking at temperatures for two different cards isn't exactly a like-for-like comparison, but it will give you a rough estimate of where they sit. Temperatures were measured in a room at 24 degrees Celsius, power measurements were taken at the wall for the entire test setup, and temperatures were allowed to stabilize for 15 minutes before recording both in the stress and idle results. At idle, the RX 560 leveled off at 37 degrees Celsius and the system drew 42 watts. The GTX 1050, on the other hand, idled at 31 degrees Celsius and only drew 32 watts from the wall. Something about the 1050's power management allows it to use almost no power when it's at idle. The 6-degree difference in temperature is due to the 1050 having a BIOS-enforced minimum fan speed of 45%, which the RX 560 does not. Under load with Unigen's Valley benchmark, the 560 topped out at 72 degrees Celsius and drew 101 watts from the wall. The GTX 1050 hit a slightly higher 76 degrees Celsius and drew 106 watts from the wall. Though there is a measurable difference in temperature and power, these results pretty much confirm what we already knew. The 560 and 1050 both have a TDP of 75 watts, and they really aren't going to draw much more power than that, nor produce more heat. From a subjective standpoint, neither card was louder nor quieter than the other, and neither one was really audible among the other noise sources in the case. Now, arguably the most important aspect of budget GPUs, performance per dollar. When you only have $130 for an upgrade, or you can only upgrade once in a long while, this is the metric you should weigh most heavily. These results come from the combined average and 1% lows for all 8 games at medium settings divided by the current market price for the cards when the video is uploaded. Both the 1050 and 560 are going for more than their MSRP right now. 1050s run about $120 at the moment, and 560s are available for around $130. These are the results. In a few words, total blowout. The 560 is running about 30% over its launch price, which puts it at a price point above the 1050, in spite of the fact that the 560 trails the 1050 in performance by about 20%. Altogether, that means the 1050 will get you about 25% more FPS per dollar than the 560, at least until, or if, prices ever go back to normal. I can only assume that the 560's price is inflated due to cryptocurrency mining, and in the context of gaming, that means you'll be getting a raw deal if you go with a 560 over a 1050. It's more expensive and noticeably slower. On top of that, there really isn't any outside benefit to picking the 560. Both cards use about the same power, make about the same noise, have the same display connectors, and neither one requires a PCIe power connector. If you're in the market for a graphics card around $120, unless you're doing some kind of compute work that absolutely requires an AMD GPU, of which I don't know any, you'll be much better served both in cost and in performance by a GTX 1050 from NVIDIA. Links to purchase the GTX 1050 and RX 560 are in the description below. If you want to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up, hit subscribe, then click the bell icon to enable notifications. So guys, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe, and if you have any questions about these graphics cards or the benchmarks, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video.